2015 and 16. We experienced the steepest 2-year increase in murder in half a century, a significant rise violent, and repeat offenders who cause death and destruction everywhere they go. These merchants of misery didn't deserve leniency, and many should count themselves lucky that they were never charged with murder. The First Step Act retroactively released many of these career criminals anyway. So the conditions for a crime wave were building before the pandemic reached our shores. Now let me be clear about something. The pandemic didn't accelerate the crime wave because people were laid off or isolated or bored. Other countries hit even harder by the coronavirus didn't see a spike in violent crime anywhere close to the one that we are experiencing. Rather, state and local federal officials foolishly slashed their prison populations by a stunning 25% in 2020 under the guise of so-called coronavirus. Some of these beneficiaries were young violent offenders who immediately returned to a life of crime. In the case of Rikers Island, authorities released 1,500 prisoners. Within less than 2 months, over 100 were back in jail. One of their most common offenses was burglary. And their crimes fueled a spike in break-ins. So much for the claim that these were harmless criminals. Next came the anarchy and rioting that followed the death of George Floyd. Rather than restoring order while allowing non-violent demonstrations, liberal officials around the country responded with insane policies that undercut the rule of law. Soros prosecutors refused to do their job as more than 500 violent riots broke out across the nation. Over 2,000 police officers were injured and line of duty deaths rose by 28%. Dozens of Americans were killed, and between $1 billion and $2 billion worth of damage was inflicted. The riots last summer were collectively the most destructive in American history. Simultaneously, the consequences of the Ferguson effect paled in comparison to the devastation wreaked by the BLM effect, which massively curtailed policing in neighborhoods most in need of vigilant law enforcement. Here are just a few examples. From the summer of 2020 to the winter of last year, police in Chicago made 53% fewer arrests compared to the same period in 2019. As a result, murder in the city rose by 65%. In New York, police made 38% fewer arrests, murders rose by 58%. In Louisville, police made 35% fewer arrests, murders rose by 87%. And in Minneapolis, police made 42% fewer arrests and murders rose by 64%. I detect a pattern. Leading Democrats called to defund the police. And at least 20 major cities agreed, slashing their police departments to the tune of $840 million. New York City alone shifted nearly $1 billion from the NYPD, and Los Angeles cut funding to its police department by $150 million. But the radicals didn't stop at defunding the police. They defamed and demoralized and disarmed our men and women in blue. Portland announced that it would no longer allow its police to use tear gas against violent demonstrators. The Seattle and Philadelphia city councils voted to ban the use of pepper spray. Many other cities limited the use of rubber bullets. It's no surprise that in such a toxic environment, police retirements surged. 15% in Chicago, 37% in Las Vegas, 72% in New York City. And recruiting is just as bad. As officers ask me when I travel around the country and speak to them about how recruiting and retention is going, who would want to be police in today's environment? And it's not because they aren't willing to put themselves in harm's way to protect the vulnerable. It's because they know that pro-criminal policies are making it impossible to do their job. This concerted nationwide attack on police is nothing less than the gravest assault on the rule of law in modern times. The simple fact is that today's Democratic Party is pro-right, anti-cop, and anti-prosecutor. Democrats today have more sympathy for violent criminals than for innocent victims. And when given power, they turn our criminal justice system into a criminal's justice system. Democrats and BLM leaders ignore an obvious truth. If you stop enforcing the law, you will catch fewer criminals, and they will commit more and usually worse crimes. Again, I can hardly believe that it needs to be said. And neither can most Americans with an ounce of common sense. But Democrats and BLM leaders long ago took leave of their senses and put their ideology ahead of your safety. Let's take a tour of the West Coast, a hotbed of far-left progressive policies, to see what happens to the rule of law when Democrats are in charge of public safety. In Portland, they defunded the police. Portland, of course, witnessed some of the worst rioting last summer. Yet city leaders consistently undermined their police, and as of January, had refused to prosecute more than 90% of arrested rioters who were responsible for 100 nights of destruction. The city government slashed the police budget by $27 million and gratuitously disbanded a special gun violence unit as well. All with predictable results. This year alone, Portland has suffered a 5-fold increase in murder. Shootings have doubled. That's compared to the same time last year. Crime is so rampant and police resources are so overstretched that residents now must wait 40 minutes before even getting a hold of an emergency dispatcher. Last week, the entire Portland Rapid Response Team resigned en masse, and more than 10% of the Portland Police Department has left the force in just the last 9 months. And frankly, I'm surprised it's not more. While Portland provides a cautionary tale against defunding the police, Seattle ran an experiment in abolishing the police. As you may recall, a group of BLM activists and Antifa radicals joined together there and created the so-called Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, better known by its acronym, the CHAZ. These armed neo-secessionists began their insurrection by forcing a police precinct to evacuate. Next, they barricaded the streets and declared a rogue province free of police and law enforcement. At the entrance to CHAZ, they hung up a sign that read, "You are now leaving the USA." Seattle's clueless mayor, Jenny Durkin, refused to act decisively against these outlaws, instead declaring it a summer of love. Inside CHAZ, it was anything but. Vandalism, disorderly conduct, and theft went unpunished. Reports of more severe crimes started to trickle out. Not surprisingly, CHAZ residents embraced vigilante justice without trial or due process. Soon enough, order broke down entirely and the anti-police experiment came to an end after 24 days. But not before 2 persons were murdered and 4 more were shot. All the victims were black men. Someone should ask the liberals who run Seattle if their lives mattered. I think they did. The final story from out west is about Chesa Boudin, the district attorney in San Francisco. Most of America has probably never heard of him, but he illustrates very well the radical pedigree and dangers of the so-called progressive prosecutors. Boudin grew up in red diapers. His family trafficked in far-left activism going back generations. His parents were left-wing, weather underground terrorists who went to prison for murdering 2 police officers and a security guard when he was a young child. Their fellow weather underground terrorists and Barack Obama's friends and mentors, Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, took custody of Chesa and raised him. Boudin lived up to this family tradition, dabbling in left-wing politics and even serving in Venezuela as a translator for Marxist dictator Hugo Chavez. Unfortunately, he brought his radicalism back home, defending criminals for a living. Last year, Boudin became district attorney in San Francisco and immediately took criminal leniency to new extremes and public safety to new lows. Let me give you just one example of Cesar Boudin's handiwork. A criminal named Troy McAllister, who faced a well-deserved life sentence as a result of California's three strikes laws and his long, violent criminal record, which included multiple robberies, thefts, and an attempted carjacking. Boudin was well aware of McAllister's criminal history because he was McAllister's defense attorney before he was elected district attorney. Despite this conflict of interest, or perhaps because of it, Boudin cut a deal with McAllister and released him back onto the streets. I think you can all guess what happened next. McAllister committed a series of crimes leading to 3 separate arrests, but Boudin refused to charge him each time. Then on New Year's Eve of last year, McAllister had quite a night. He got a gun, stole a car, robbed a bakery, and then sped through the city until he ran over 2 women crossing the road. One was a 60-year-old homeless woman named Elizabeth. The other was a 27-year-old Japanese immigrant named Hanako Abi. McAllister hit both women so hard with his stolen pickup truck that they were literally knocked out of their shoes. Both women died from their injuries. McAllister's own uncle expressed shock that Boudin had let his nephew out of jail, saying, quote, "I don't know why they released him. I really cannot understand it." End quote. I can answer the question. Boudin released McAllister because he is a radical ideologue who puts half-baked far-left politics over the safety of our citizens. Hanako and Elizabeth and many other San Franciscans are dead because Cesar Boudin refused to do his job. Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, all run entirely by Democrats, like so many other cities suffering from this crime wave. One Democrat above all could speak out against this insanity, and that's Joe Biden. If the president were the Joe Biden of the 1990s, who claimed to be tough on crime and vainly bristled that the Clinton crime bill should be called the Biden crime bill, perhaps he would. But this Joe Biden is hardly better than Cesar Boudin. After all, he nominated, as a vice president, a woman who encouraged donations last summer to a bail fund for rioters and looters. It's only gotten worse since Joe Biden took office. The president has stocked his Department of Justice with pro-criminal lawyers. Attorney General Merrick Garland wants to reduce prison sentences for drug traffickers and gang members. Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta has testified that every single American citizen and institution is racist. Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark has adamantly championed the cause of defunding the police. But the president doesn't stop there. He wants to eliminate qualified immunity for police so criminals can sue cops. He supports ending cash bail, which, as we've seen, would unleash thousands of career criminals onto the streets to commit more crimes and intimidate their victims and witnesses. The president supports sanctuary cities and has slashed immigration enforcement. Under this administration, ICE deportations have fallen to their lowest level on record, while illegal border crossings have reached a 21-year high. Illegal aliens, including criminal aliens and cartel members, feel welcomed in Joe Biden's America. Just this week, the president also endorsed reducing criminal sentencing for crack dealers. The only solution the president has recommended to fight violent crime is the same one he impotently proposes again and again after every tragedy. A crackdown on the Second Amendment. A gun grabber's wish list is not an anti-crime agenda. What we heard the other day from the president was sadly little more than the same tired liberal talking points that created this crime wave in the first place. Every one of these actions endanger the American people and make our streets less safe. After just a few months in office, the Biden administration is well on its way to becoming the most pro-crime administration in history. Though the president has turned his back on the hardworking, law-abiding citizens he once championed, normal Americans still see and feel the heartbreak. According to Gallup, 78% of Americans are concerned about rising crime, and more than half the country thinks that the problem is extremely or very serious. Just as normal Americans understand the problem better than Washington, they also know the solution: more and better policing. Twice as many Americans believe the criminal justice system is too soft on criminals compared to those who think it's too tough. And 86% of Americans want more or the same amount of time for the police in their communities, including 81% of blacks. Indeed, blacks and Hispanics are actually more likely than whites to want an increased police presence in their communities. Yet every day we are told by the nation's elite that Americans actually want more leniency and weakness towards criminals. Criminals who attack our police have ever walked a beat in a dangerous neighborhood, or run to the sound of gunfire, or kick down the door after reports of domestic violence. Now, paid speeches and TV contracts and fundraising galas aren't quite as dangerous, or quite so noble either. Police officers doing the hard work of saving lives and changing communities for the better are the ones who are taking these risks. Left-wing agitators, on the other hand, are encouraging crime and suffocating opportunity. The American people know who the real heroes are. From our city halls to the halls of Congress, our leaders need to get on the same page as our people. It's time to get tough on crime again. I suggest 4 basic principles to do so. First, as I've said before, we don't have an over-incarceration problem. We have an under-incarceration problem in America. In 2019, even before the recent crime surge, only 41% of violent crime, 34% of sexual assaults, and 32% of property crimes were even reported to the police. Only a fraction of those reports ever led to an arrest or conviction. When they did, on average, state prisoners served only 44% of their sentences. Murderers, on average, served less than 60% of their sentences. Murderers. These facts paint a clear picture that more criminals should be in jail today, not fewer. So before you saddle up your high horse about so-called over-incarceration or mass incarceration, go tell it to a rape victim whose rapist was never brought to justice. Or to the family of a murder victim who never got justice. Why don't you let me know what they think? Second, the only good Soros prosecutor is a defeated Soros prosecutor. These radicals have no business holding any public office anywhere in our nation. Every single one of them should be recalled, removed, and replaced. It's very simple. If you do not want to prosecute crime, you should not be a prosecutor. Third, if we did not have a border crisis, we would not have a drug crisis. The majority of meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl comes across our southern border. This year alone, the Border Patrol has seized enough deadly doses of fentanyl to kill every single American several times over. If we secure our border, we can block this flow of deadly narcotics and save tens of thousands of lives. If not, more Americans will continue to die as a result. An open border is a death sentence for many Americans. Fourth, policing is one of the great civil rights issues of our time. Weak policing, weak prosecuting, and weak sentencing hurts blacks more than any other group of our citizens. African Americans tragically constitute approximately half of all murder victims and regularly suffer the brunt of the damage resulting from riots. The fair-weather protesters who so fondly decry systemic racism fail to see a cruel irony. If, as they claim, racist policy is defined solely by a racially disparate outcome, then their recon crime proposals are in fact breathtakingly racist. When it comes to the morality of the rule of law, we should never take lectures from those who coddle criminals. Now, we can put these principles into action in a number of common sense ways. We can begin by declaring a national emergency and surging resources, technology, and personnel to lock down our southern border. We need to finish the barrier wall on the border while also hardening our ports of entry and ensuring they have the most advanced drug detection tools in the world. Some may balk at the cost of securing the border, but the cost of an insecure border is far greater. As we secure our border, our government must go beyond simple defense. We must go on offense and fight the drug trade at its source. The United States must lead our labors in Latin America and insist on greater cooperation from them to crack down on our hemisphere's drug cartels. The Sinaloa cartel alone has killed far more Americans than ISIS or Al-Qaeda ever has. And we must not stand by as illicit Chinese super labs continue to ship massive quantities of fentanyl and its chemical precursors to Latin America for production and shipment across our border and into the United States. But we also have to solve our crime problem at home by reinvesting in what one might call the 3 Ps of law enforcement: police, prosecutors, and prisons. We should begin by making a once-in-a-generation investment in police salaries, training, and equipment, with the goal of putting 100,000 new officers on the street. Back in the 1990s, after all, Joe Biden voted for 100,000 new officers. He'd like to take credit for it. For once, he was right. And the solution would help again. These new officers would contribute to more safety, security, and prosperity for our communities. Furthermore, we have to enforce the laws in the books, including so-called minor or lifestyle crimes. That means, once again, fighting vagrancy and vandalism, just as we do violent crime. Disrespect for the law doesn't start with murder, and it must be stopped before it costs lives. Next, we need to ensure that criminals who are put in the squad car are then put behind bars. This means surging federal prosecutors to especially dangerous cities and encouraging voters to remove Soros prosecutors wherever they are found. States should also pass honesty in sentencing legislation so that criminals serve at least 3/4 of their prison sentences. And we must have zero tolerance for rioting and political violence of all kinds, even when criminals have faddish views, the faculty lounge. Finally, we must invest in our nation's prison system so that our jails and prisons have the resources to safely and securely hold inmates while giving them an opportunity to turn their lives around and become law-abiding productive members of society. Pre-release immigration programming, work training, drug rehabilitation, and mental health resources should be mandatory for prisoners who need it. Our prisons also must not become dens of crime in themselves. We should crack down on prison gangs and improve prison safety protocols. Congress should pass my bill to enable prisons to jam the signals of contraband cell phones, the key tool by criminals used to continue committing crimes while in prison. And we should improve pay and benefits for our nation's correctional officers. And likewise, expand the ranks of parole officers and encourage increased specialization, all of which reduces recidivism rates. Yes, it will cost money, but public safety is the most basic responsibility of government at every level. Now, some well-meaning people believe that we have too many people in prison already because they compare our prison population with the prison population of other random countries. This is not the way to make policy. The simple truth is this: the right number of people in prison should be determined by the number of people who commit crimes. And once they're convicted, they should be headed to the best and most effective prisons in the world. Some less well-intentioned people assert that building prisons are, in fact, a way to increase the number of prisoners. A backbench congresswoman from New York recently claimed that if you build prisons, they'll operate like the Field of Dreams. Build it and they come. But criminals go to prison for one reason: committing crimes. And refusing to build prisons does not reduce crime. Of course, it would only increase crime by letting criminals remain on the streets. This vigorous, aggressive strategy to break the current crime wave succeeded in the past, and it will succeed in the future as long as we have the fortitude and courage and discipline to implement it. Safe streets and low crime rates aren't inevitable, but rather require constant vigilance and strong leadership. We must never forget how bad things once were and can become even. Between 1973 and 1991, violent criminals injured nearly 37 million Americans. If crime rates had remained at peak levels, 83% of Americans over the age of 12 would have become a victim of violent crime at some point in their life. 40% would have been injured in a robbery or an assault. If we continue the path we are on, we will return to the dark days of soaring crime and terrifying nights filled with muggings, rapes, and murders. Or we can say once and for all that we will never go back to that. Instead, we will reestablish the rule of law. We will lock up criminals. We will deliver justice for victims, and we will protect the innocent. Thankfully, we have some of the finest men and women anywhere in the world to accomplish this objective. The story of the heroic American lawman is almost as old as our nation itself. In the days to come, new chapters must be written. Our heroes in blue have been beaten and bruised over this past year, but they are unbowed and unbroken. They have bravely and loyally held the line through chaos and criticism, and now it's time for them to take back our streets. And with our support, I am confident they will. So thank you. God bless you. God bless our police, and God bless the United States of America.
Senator Cotton, I want to start just by thanking you for your wonderful remarks today and for being able to take some questions, and also thank the audience for being here. Again, I'm Robert Edmund Wallace, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, working primarily on our police and public safety initiative. You know, Ryan was exactly right when it comes to highlighting the excess of the work of the justice reform movement and expressing support for our nation's law enforcement. I think your voice has been the loudest and most consistent in Congress, and I personally appreciate that. And while it hasn't always been this way, though, from where I sit, it seems like your willingness to speak out on these issues puts you in a camp that seems to have been dwindling in size for some time. And that takes me to my first question, which is that, the criminal justice reform movement, the police reform movement has been extremely successful over the last decade, especially. As you pointed out, trends of decreasing incarceration, decreasing arrests, decreasing police force sizes. The election of progressive prosecutors, it goes on. The movement seems to continue benefiting from its perception that it's an underdog movement, that it is a la public enemy, fighting the power. Is that true, particularly in Congress, or is it the case that the criminal justice reform movement has more momentum than some people let on?
Yeah, the poor, beleaguered BLM movement, supported only by George Soros' millions, donations from virtually all of corporate America, editorial boards of the New York Times, the newsrooms at every major news network. How could they possibly ever be anything other than the underdog? The reality is that those elements of our society are in fact at the high citadels of most places of power, whether it's in business or big tech, Hollywood, media, universities, also all kinds of politics, regrettably, because that's where the rubber meets the road on criminal justice policy. And I think that's in part because so many people empowering those institutions have forgotten just how bad it was. It's easy to get up on your high horse, 8 to 10 years ago, after we had benefited from 20 years of hard-nosed and clear-eyed policing. And murder rates and violent crimes were still at record low levels. Yet none of them seem to have learned the lesson of the last 5 or 6 years, especially the lesson of the last 18 months. And you have some Democratic politicians like Joe Biden who are beginning to see it, in part because they're worried about the electoral consequences of the effects of their soft on crime policy. But it's definitely correct to say that the supporters of the criminal leniency movement in America hold a lot of the high command in our society. About beleaguered, oppressed, small, scrappy underdogs.
Right. You mentioned learning lessons, and that's actually a really important theme, I think, in the work that we do in the Ad Institute. And one of the ways that you learn lessons is by evaluating policy. One of the most sort of important and consequential criminal justice reforms at the federal level is the First Step Act, which you mentioned in your remarks, which, for some people who don't know, does quite a lot of things. Among those things, it creates a risk assessment that will be implemented for people going into federal prisons, and that will determine, where they're housed, what kind of programming becomes available to them, which, by virtue of taking advantage of that program, you can bring time credits and early release. But one other element of that is that there was supposed to be some follow-up on how the First Step Act is working out. There was supposed to be some data on the success of various initiatives that the legislation covered. But correct me if I'm wrong, I don't seem to have been able to find that anywhere. And my question to you is there a plan to actually follow through on that commitment? And what do you expect to find?
Yeah, curiously, all these jawbreakers who want to let serious and repeat violent felons out of prison don't have an interest in seeing what happens to them once they get out of prison, given recidivism rates in our society. You mentioned the Independent Review Committee and the First Step Act, but it was much too short a time period to actually evaluate what had happened. I think the reports came in late last year. Obviously, the echo of that law is going to be heard for many years to come, given recidivism rates in this country. Or when we were debating the act, I proposed an amendment that would have tracked the actual recidivism rates of every single person who was released under that. Suffice it to say, the Democrats wanted nothing to do with it, and a lot of the Republican sponsors of the bill as well. Now, that report did have one interesting conclusion. It said that basically the entire premise of the First Step Act, identity, evidence-based anti-recidivism training programs, was nothing more than aspirational, that the evidence was pretty thin, it was not clear at all which ones worked and which ones didn't work, and that there needs to be more effort invested in trying to determine what we can do to help prisoners turn their lives around and get back to being productive members of society. I mean, I have my hunches about that. I suspect a lot of them finding God in prison, getting an education, getting a skill, the basic things to help anyone succeed in life will help them succeed as well. But the report did conclude that the entire premise of the First Step Act was really nothing more than aspirational.
Yeah, that's concerning for me, especially as Congress is in the process of considering new police reform legislation.
Yeah, well, and not just police reform, more criminal leniency. Just a few days ago, Joe Biden is so worried about the crime wave in America and its political consequences for his party that he disrupted his push to get a $6 trillion spending package, get an infrastructure bill, do this, that, and the other thing to give a rush speech about crime from the White House. Earlier that day, his party was having hearings in the Judiciary Committee about legislation that would release crack dealers in prison early and shorten their sentences in the future. To give you a sense of what they really think, not what Joe Biden says when cameras are on at the White House.
No, I actually was able to catch some of that hearing. One of the really interesting things that came out of it was in the testimony of Michael Porter, who actually highlighted that there was quite a bit of support in the black community for some of the harsher sentencing that came in the 1980s. Which takes me, to one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which is that you've been critical of the BLM movement, and which I think, their critique of the criminal justice system, I think, has been at the root of a lot of the reforms that have been enacted in recent years. It really is the elephant in the room in any conversation about crime, policing, incarceration, etc. But when you look at these enforcement statistics, when you look at the number of people in prison, the racial breakdown of arrestees, and people shot by police, you cannot help but notice that there are real disparities along the racial lines, and people seize on this and make very powerful arguments in favor of very far-reaching reforms. And what do you say to people who look at those numbers and find them disconcerting to the point that they cannot possibly believe that a system that produces that kind of disparity is fair?
Many look at our criminal justice system and think that there are too many black men in prison. I think there are too many black victims of crime all across our country. The statistics are staggering and heartbreaking. You're much more likely to be a victim of crime as an African American citizen than anyone else in our country. That's one reason why so many African Americans want policing to maintain its current presence in their neighborhoods or increase its presence, because they bear the brunt whenever the police are not present and when crime rises. And you mentioned the hearing we had the other day on crack cocaine sentencing. It is now just taken as gospel, as a matter of writ, that the difference in sentencing between crack cocaine and powder cocaine is just pure and outright racism. Perfect example of systemic racism in the criminal justice system. And as you point out, some of the most vocal proponents of the crackdown in the 1980s on crack cocaine sentencing were leaders in the Congressional Black Caucus, because it was devastating their communities and their districts back home. Some other people that supported that crackdown was then Senator Joe Biden, then Senator Dick Durbin, chair of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Pat Leahy, he's been a senator for that long, on the Judiciary Committee, then Congressman Chuck Schumer. I could go on and on and on. That has reasons then, based on the nature of the trade, particularly violent nature of the trade around it. But if they want to eliminate the differences between the sentences, I'm perfectly willing to do that. But my proposal is a little bit different from theirs. If they want to take down sentences for crack cocaine, I'm perfectly willing to increase sentences for powder cocaine. And I've introduced legislation to do just that.
I suspect there will be a ton of support for that initiative, but maybe speaking out of turn. One of the other reforms before Congress right now, you mentioned it in one of your remarks, is the issue of qualified immunity. Maybe are also very limited in the law. And I've kind of been critical of this proposal myself, in so far as it doesn't really seem to account for the reality of indemnification. For those of you who don't know, basically it means that most municipalities will pick up the tab whenever police officers are successfully sued in their individual capacities. And so I think, sort of both sides of this argument overstate their cases. So the question is twofold. Do you think there is room for some kind of middle ground reform on qualified immunity, or do you think it will continue to be a point of contention that we never reach point of view on?
Qualified immunity has a long and somewhat tangled history in the courts. It goes back, it's really a judge-made doctrine from the middle part of the last century, when the Warren and Burke courts were reaching, in my opinion, very ill-advised decisions on criminal justice and criminal procedure as well. and they began to worry about the far-reaching implications of those decisions.